Hey everybody, welcome to the 440 Guitar Podcast. I am your host today, Jerrell Powell. Thank you so much for tuning up. You can catch the podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and anchor.fm/440. Be sure to follow the podcast as well on Instagram at the 440 Guitar Podcast, just so you can get updates on the episodes when they're coming out. And if you have a question or want to reach out to me, feel free to send me a direct message through Instagram at the 440 Podcast, or you can also email me as well. You can email me over at the 440podcast at gmail.com. So feel free to do that if you'd like to do so. Today, I am very excited, blessed, and honored to have this guest here on the show. This artist has well over 20 years of experience just being in the music business. He's a prolific artist, fantastic guitar player, songwriter, producer, and a two-time Grammy Award winning artist as well. He shared the stage with some of the most known musicians in the industry, such as The Roots, John Mayer, Rolling Stones, Tedeschi Trucks, and many, many others. He's released two solo albums. His second album called Blood from the Stone in 2016, and working on a new album as well. But everything that he's released, he's continued to electrify the audience with every note that he plays. The 440 Guitar Podcast is excited to have Eric Krasno.
Nice. I like that intro. Thank you, man.
On the show, of course, man.
Yeah.
Of course,
including the live audience. I did.
Absolutely. How are you, man?
I'm good, man. You know, it's been a crazy year and a half, 2 years, whatever it's been.
Yeah.
You know, I took on a lot of new things on all sides of life in the past year and a half. I got married. We had a baby.
Wow.
We bought a new house. We moved. So, which was in a weird way. I mean, I wouldn't wish 2020 on anybody, but in a weird way, I was really fortunate to make kind of the best out of it in a certain way, and got to live that home life that I hadn't lived for so long. I'd been on the road, and I also made a new album, really two new albums, to be honest. One that's about to come out and one that'll be in the queue after that. So it was very productive. But I have to admit that, like, I have some anxiety about now things are ramping up and I'm doing so many shows and things on top of a lot of these other kind of new things that I'd created, where I'm producing for people and doing a podcast. And so I'm trying to, like, keep up, you know what I mean? And then also running around after my baby.
Yeah.
You know, my wife really is taking the load of that work, but, yeah, it's been a crazy time, man. And I leave tomorrow for a tour where with the whole family's coming with me. And
oh, wow.
So crazy, man. It's crazy.
Wow. That's awesome. Yeah. I was going to ask you, as far as, how you feel when it comes to, everyone going through what they went through last year, and talking to some artists such as yourself, where it's like some people, they made music during the quarantine. Some people, they didn't touch the guitar for like 7 months, just because of everything going on. So just given that everything is, the restrictions are lifting and everything, it's interesting that you said as far as the anxiety of it all, where it's like, wait, I'm not ready.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, it's nuts, man. But overall, I'm excited to get out there and excited to be playing. And I have a single that comes out. It'll be out by the time this comes out.
Cool.
Called So Cold. We dropped like a little teaser today, and I have an album coming out September 17th that has been done for about a year, actually.
Oh, wow.
Or longer, but we didn't want to release it without being able to tour, and it actually worked out because I was able to build a West Coast band. I moved to LA about 2 years ago.
Oh, wow.
And I have pieced together like this amazing new band called The Assembly. And we've been going out. We did our first gig last month, or a few weeks ago, at Red Rocks. We got to open for the Motet. It was our first show in front of like 6,000 people, which was amazing. And then did a club show at Cervantes in Denver the next night. And that was kind of our warm-up gigs to get the band kind of started.
Yeah.
And now we've got a bunch of gigs lined up. We're playing in Austin, Texas in August on the 12th. And I'm actually going to New York tomorrow. This week. I'll be at the Blue Note, June 29th and 30th and July 1st with my trio. So like I said, we're kind of like we hit the ground running when things started opening up. It had been a while since I'd actually been on stage. So yeah, it's feeling good to play again, especially now with having kind of created all this new material. I've been anxious to play it live, you know.
Awesome. That's phenomenal. Yeah, it's funny because I remember when I discovered you, and I think you probably doing multiple projects during that time, but I know you were in Soul Live. And I was like, man, I gotta see him play, but he's over, he's like in like Chicago or like Illinois, around that part. So I'd have to probably fly out to see you. So given that might be a little easier to see you now, so I'm excited for that in general.
yeah. Where are you based actually?
Long Beach, California.
Okay. Oh, cool. So you're just down the road. Yeah, we're gonna book an LA show soon, like around the release of the album. So like the album comes out September 17th, but it'll be somewhere around that time period.
Nice.
But I'm excited for that. It's great to have a West Coast band now, because when I first moved to LA, I was flying back to New York a lot or collaborating with different people. But this album, I actually got to work with a guy named Otis McDonald. He's the one guy that lives in the Bay Area, but we're all California. And I linked up with him through Adam Deitch from Lettuce and also Will Blades, who's in my band. They both recommended that we link up, and I started following him on Instagram, and I was kind of like blown away by the tracks he was making. And I was like, we just started talking, and he was like, hey, I'm doing this project called Song Aid, and we're doing a kind of a benefit album. Would you want to be down? And I was like, yeah, man, let's do it. And we did a song called Man and Me, Bob Dylan track, which is actually that single came out a while ago, but it's also a part of my new album. And we made that track just by I ended up just putting down that song. Had been kind of in my ethos for a while, but my wife had been pregnant a couple months, and like the whole theme of the song was like digging at me, and I was like, man, I need to cut a version of this song. So I sat down and did a real simple version, kind of like acoustic, and sent him the tracks. And then he filled it out with drums and keys and bass, sent it back to me, and I was blown away.
Wow.
So, because I was thinking about making an acoustic album at that time, because I was like, okay, what can I do by myself? Because COVID is happening. I have my own little studio. So I'd do like percussion, bass. It was like acoustic-ish. But then when I started working with him, I was like, well, maybe I can make like the album I really want to make, and just work with him over the internet. So we started sending tracks back and forth, and it worked so seamlessly.
Yeah.
He just had such a great way of translating my ideas into full fruition, and then also we just became really tight. He had a 1-year-old son while my wife was pregnant with a boy. So we kind of like also connected on that. And when we finally got together, it got even better. You know what I mean? So, I mean, most of the record was made all by sending tracks back and forth, but then we were able to link up towards the end of it and like mix it. And then he came down here. We worked in my studio, and then he has a studio in San Francisco. He actually has a room at Hyde Street Studios, which is where a lot of amazing legendary albums I listened to were made, from Herbie Hancock, Headhunters, and Thrust, and all that, to Grateful Dead, American Beauty, to Crosby, Stills and Nash, then all the way up to Tupac. So like all these like Bay Area classic albums were made in the room where we ended up mixing and doing a lot of the tracking for this album. Wow. So anyway, fast forward to a few months ago, and we were like, okay, we got to start playing this music. And he was like, man, I want to be down with this. So he plays all the sorts of instruments, but he ended up playing bass. And then we assembled a killer band of LA guys that all can sing great and play great. They all make their own records too. So like they're all like are kind of leaders in their own right. And
wow.
So I'm excited because as this evolves and as the band evolves, I'll have them singing more and leading, and they all play all different instruments. So it's great, man. It's great.
That's awesome. So on the 440 Guitar Podcast, we're really big on origin stories, how people got to where they are today. So to rewind here, tell me about your earliest memory of music.
My earliest memory of music is probably listening to well, there's a few things, but my grandfather was a musician, so
Mm.
he used to play violin and piano. When I was really small, I remember him playing in my living room and being like kind of in awe of like the power and the emotion that would come out of his instruments.
Mm.
So it was really started there, and then also my dad would play. You know, he wasn't a professional musician in the way that my grandfather was, but he would have jam sessions in our living room. You know, and then there was times when my brother also would have would it was really family oriented jam sessions
Mm.
that would happen at my house, and I was influenced by those. But it wasn't really until I didn't start playing music really. I mean, I would tinker around, and I took lessons when I was really young.
Mm.
But eventually, when I was like 12 or 13, I got a bass guitar for Christmas, and I started playing that, and then um, was like kind of attempting to jam with my brother and his friends, and they would say, "Hey, you got to go practice, you know, and come back down." So we had a basement with some equipment in there, and you know, I just could tell how much they were having fun. And then it was really like, you know, it's hard to get enthusiastic about music. Like I tell this to a lot of the younger musicians, like that are trying to, or even friends that are teaching their children. It's like
Yeah.
I had when I had music class, and they would teach me classical music or sight reading, I couldn't really relate to it. And then once I was a fan of music, like once I found the bands that really got me excited, like I remember Led Zeppelin
Mm.
just blew my mind at age 12 or 13.
Yeah.
And then I just wanted to learn those songs, you know,
Mm.
which was really when I took off, you know, into music, because I would just sit there and I'd want to learn all these Jimmy Page guitar parts and want to learn Jimi Hendrix. And once I kind of had the bands that were mine, because my parents liked the Beatles and they liked the Stones, and I loved that. They liked jazz. And then my brother liked like Kiss and Van Halen and things like that. And then I kind of got into Zeppelin and Hendrix, and that just spoke to me, you know. And
Wow.
that was when I really dove into music, you know, and that's when and then there was no going back after that, you know.
Yeah, yeah. I find it interesting, as far as this your experience of music was that specifically was involving other people playing music, you know, and you
Yeah.
kind of getting interested in that. And then the second thing to me is where you really it really sunk in as far as like wanting to learn, you know, these songs or riffs or just learn the instrument in general when it was something you liked, because
Yeah.
that resonates to me, because I remember speaking to Josh Smith and he said, you know, practice what you want to learn, like, or
Yeah.
what you're
Yeah. Yeah.
excited about, passionate about. And
Yeah.
I think
You have
sometimes
to.
people forget that, you know. I think that sometimes that can be a forgotten thing that's so important.
Yeah. I mean, I also taught of some lessons in the beginning of the lockdown, and that was one of my kind of important pieces to that, which I also had to remind myself that it's not. I mean, knowing scales is important,
Mm.
but it's the way you practice them, and the way I always encourage people to practice musically. You know
Mm.
what I mean? So like practice your own way, develop your own way of playing and your own way of expressing yourself. You
Mm.
know,
Mm.
I'm not saying technique isn't important, but you know, scales up and down the neck will help your dexterity, but they don't necessarily feed your musicianship. Sometimes you need to. Um, I do think learning other people's solos is a good way to, but I don't. But it also, you don't want to get lost in that and become a clone of anyone else. I think it's about absorbing, you know, what you can from what other people have done, and then trying to make it your own. You know.
I agree. I 100% agree. Have you had a situation where, kind of like speaking to that a little bit, where like if you're listening to something that you're really excited or passionate about, but then you kind of have to stop listening to it for a while because you feel like, oh man, I'm kind of playing like the same person that I've been listening to for so long.
Oh yeah, yeah. Well, there's guitar players that I love that if I'm around them, I start to sound like them, you know. Like John Scofield is a huge influence of mine, and I've played with him a lot. And when I listen back to recordings of playing with him, like with Soul Live or whatever, I can hear myself just like spitting back like the Schofieldisms, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I kind of am like that when I talk to people. Like if someone talks to me, I'll take on some of their mannerisms or their accent even.
Yeah.
My dad always was like that when we were younger. But I feel like it relates to music. Same with Derek Trucks. It's like when I'm around Derek for a while, I start to like play the riffs, his riffs, or like, or some of his styles will just come out. And I think that I mean, for those two guys, I'm also a huge fan. So I think it's but I listen back to recordings and I'm like, oh man, what am I doing? I'm just like totally ripping them off right in front of them. But I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I think like you don't want to overdo it, but there's times where, you know, I've been fortunate in that way that I've been around great musicians that were way better than me, honestly. You know, I mean, like a lot of the guys in Lettuce and Soul Live, for that matter, coming up around those guys really elevated me, you know, because there was times where I had no idea what they were doing, and I kind of like, it was like the fake it till you make it thing, you know, where but it would force me to get better, you know.
Wow. Yeah, I find that to be interesting too. Specifically talking about because I'm a fan of John Scofield as well, including Derek Trucks. Derek Trucks really, he's like I think he's the best slide guitar player of all time. Like
Me too.
It's just
I think it's not even a question.
Yeah,
like you know,
there's just because there's I forgot the song that he was playing. It might have been I think it was a Tedeschi Trucks live performance I watched on YouTube, and it was like the first time that I caught wind of of him, found out you discovered him, and I was blown away. And then obviously your relationship working with Derek Trucks in the past, and even having him on your podcast, which I want to talk about in a bit as far as that experience. But as far as what I find so interesting too is that he's such an emotional player, but he has this stoic face.
Totally. I say that all the time. I talk about that all the time because meanwhile I'm making all these crazy faces constantly. In fact, my drummer sent me a picture today of me completely like freaking out, like, and him too. It's real. I actually may have to show you. I don't know, but look at this one. So I don't know if your viewers or if your listeners will see that, but it's me looking like I'm just like in the worst pain. Someone's like yanking out my appendix or something. But so it's a pretty funny juxtaposition when I'm on stage next to Derek and we're soloing, because I'm making these faces and cringing and moving this way, and he's just straight, man. And I'm like, how do you play like that and not even move? But it's it's a beautiful thing. I've actually been taking some vocal lessons recently, finally, and one of the things my vocal teacher was telling me that is like, man, you got to stop contorting yourself when you're going for these notes, because when you're singing, that's going to clench up your throat. And that's going to, like, you want your airflow to be steady and open when you're singing. And I'm so used to just when I'm playing guitar, making these expressions and moving my body around. And he's like, man, you got to try to like get rid of that. And I'm like, oh, I can't. But I'm trying to work on it, because, to me, it's that same application to singing. It's like when I'm playing, I'm essentially singing, right. But then I'm trying to train my voice to sound right, to be able to sing what I'm thinking, which is right. So anyway, it's a process to try to calm down these other things going on in my body. and let the air flow correctly.
Man, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I wanted to talk a little bit as far as, you know, obviously you're a multi-dimensional talent, and then especially from a producing side as well. When did you start? When did you start producing projects and artists, and how did that happen?
You know, that goes really, really far back. I mean,
Mm.
back to high school.
Oh wow.
I was, I went to a really small school. There wasn't a lot of other musicians. I did have a band, but at one point they let me kind of take over this weird room that they had set up and let me use it as a studio. I
Mm.
went to a boarding school in Vermont where it was on a farm and it was really out there, mostly visual arts students. Um, and I basically got a 4-track recorder, an 8-track recorder eventually, but initially a 4-track, and started like figuring out how to make records, you know, on my own. It was so, I mean, I was always the kid at home. Like this goes even further back where I'd like find an old tape deck, figure out how to record onto that, and then record to another tape deck and then back to the other one. And I'd be like, oh, I can
Wow.
overdub myself. You know, I mean, it starts even before that. I had a record player that had a tape deck in it, and I would record myself. First, I realized that it had an input. I wish like I had that record player still. You could play along with the record and record it on the tape. I mean, it sounded like crap, but
Whoa.
I could play along with Led Zeppelin and be like, and fucking record it. And then I realized there was a mic. I mean, I was always tinkering with stuff, you know, like
Yeah.
my parents would come home and I'd have like the whole entertainment system like unplugged and they'd be like, what the hell are you doing? But I could also take things apart. I was always into plugging things in, figuring out how they worked. So when I was in high school, I started recording my own projects, and I just didn't. I just wanted to learn how records were made. So I
Mm.
would go in and start recording myself playing drums really badly, and then I'd layer bass and guitar, and eventually sing on it. And
Wow.
I was always like trying to make records in whatever way that I could. You know, I was so fascinated to hear myself back, like just the mere like just the most basic recording of myself. I'd be like, oh my god, that's me, you know.
Mm.
And this is way before even like you could burn a CD of yourself. You know, in college, I started burning CDs of my stuff, and people would be like, I'd be like, oh my god, I'm on a CD. Um, Now people can upload their music the same day, and it's there, you know, and
Right.
it's there for the world. But you know, it just evolved over time. I mean, and then like as far as like really producing and making records, you know, when I had bands, you know, with Soul Live, we got signed pretty early. You know, Alan Evans is a great engineer
Mm.
from Soul Live, and he really showed me a lot too because we had ADAT machines and little Mackie mixers, and I basically got the same gear Al had because I was like, oh man, I need he showed, you know, and he would show me how to use things, and then it evolved into Pro Tools. The first thing I ever produced ever was an artist named Guapele, and she,
Oh wow. I
yeah,
know her.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So she recorded on her first album in my apartment in Brooklyn. I mean, I produced stuff way before that, lots of hip hop stuff on tapes
Yeah.
but that was the first one that was like really on a label, and that record became a gold record,
Wow.
which was crazy because we made it in my apartment, literally with an ADAT machine and my ASR 10 sampler and a Rhodes keyboard and guitars plugged in. I mean, I didn't even have amps; I was just plugging directly into a Mackie,
Wow.
and luckily with a mixer who mixed it, you know, figured out ways to make it sound better. But I didn't have a lot. I had to record a lot of it into my sampler, so I'd play the guitar into my ASR 10 and then trigger that. I mean,
Wow.
I literally was trying to figure it out as I went. And
Wow.
technology was so different then. You know, I try to explain that to younger producers now that just have everything on their laptop. They open up their laptop. I mean, dude, the stuff we used to go through to record stuff, you know, and we didn't have separated outs. I don't
Right.
know how technical you get on this show, but like, you know, I would try to figure out how to get, and a lot of times I'd have to trigger the play button on my sequencer perfectly as I would solo or mute tracks so I could layer them, you know, and make them
Wow.
separate. And anyway, I could go on that off on that for hours, but that record was a gold record, and then I realized, wow, I'm actually a producer. That was the first time I got to say I was a producer. You know what I mean?
Wow.
I'd been producing for 10 years at that point,
right?
But not on a label or anything. And then when Soul Live got signed, which is around the same time, we got to work with great producers. And I basically was the first guy there and the last guy to leave. I just wanted to learn everything from them.
Wow.
Shout out to Basie Bob Brockman, was one of the first producers and engineers that I worked with. And he was really amazing because he knew that I had that bug and that I was like, and so he showed me a lot. And also a guy named Kirk Yano was huge for me. He was an engineer, producer who'd worked on a million records, back from P-Funk to Public Enemy to Mariah Carey, everywhere in between. When I moved to New York, he basically let me set up a studio in his studio complex, and I just hung out in there, man. And like Jay Dilla came through, and Beatnuts and Common and Dwele. I worked on Dwele's early albums while I was there. So just being in that world there was so huge, because I got to watch some of the greatest producers on earth, you know, from hip hop to pop. There's a guy named DJ Spinna, who a lot of people know as one of the greatest DJs, but he's an incredible producer. And I used to play guitar on his records, and he would let me hang around and watch him mix and watch him track and learn the technical stuff. And he also had an insane record collection, and which he would basically like trade me like break beats for guitar tracks, you know. And also the Beatnuts, Psycho Les, Juju, those guys were huge mentors for me. I played because basically they loved me because I could play instruments and knew how to kind of layer stuff. So if they had a sample that they couldn't clear, I would play all those parts. I'd play guitar, I'd play bass, I'd play piano, I'd even sing if I had to. So I was like a utility for a lot of these guys to be like, oh, we can't use this sample,
right?
But Kraz will come in and just play whatever we need, where we can make it sound like that. And I also grew up on hip hop music as well as rock and as well as jazz. So I was kind of in a unique place because I could understand the music, but I also could understand the feel of hip hop and understand how to make it sound chopped up like a sample. You know what I mean? Whereas a lot of like session musicians in that time period were not really aware of that. You know what I mean? They were guys that were used to doing pop records, and not really didn't have that sensibility. Whereas like I was like listening to Pete Rock, I was listening to Dilla, I was listening to all that stuff. So that was a really fun period, man. And then I got to produce. As time went on, I would be in the studio with those guys, and they'd realize I had beats too. You know, they'd be like, "Oh, wait, Kraz has beats, and there's no samples on them." So that because at that time everybody was having issues with samples. Yeah. So Talib Kweli was one of the first guys that kind of put me on, and he got me on. I produced a lot of stuff for him. A guy named J Live, who was like one of my favorite rappers back then. Dwele. I got to work with so many people, you know, all over the map that really helped me figure it out, you know, what producing even was, you know, because it also goes beyond just making the tracks, making the beat. It goes, you know, how to get the best performance out of an artist, how to find their best material, how to help them develop their material, and in certain cases, help them develop their own vision as an artist. You know, which is something that I'm way more tuned into now. You know, that took a long time to understand. And that's my favorite thing now, is when I get to work with someone in that developmental stage and help guide them to making their first great album or first great creative statement. So I really get off on that. You know what I mean? That's exciting for me, because that's like something that'll never, you know, as a producer, you get to do that over and over. And as an artist, you do it once, you know, right. And as a producer, you get to be a part of these really exciting times. I was just talking to an artist that I've been working with a long time, and she's getting some incredible opportunities right now, and working with her heroes. And she always calls me when she is like walking into a new situation to like get guidance. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, okay, I'm going to be in the studio with these huge artists, you know, let's talk. And I help her and usually I just kind of reinforce what she's already thinking. I'm like, listen, they're putting you in that room because of your creativity and because you're an artist. So, you know, bring that to the table. Don't just do what you think they want. Do what you bring your artistry with you. So like I said, man, being a producer is so exciting.
That's awesome.
It's and then it really is in turn why I ended up becoming a solo artist too, because I like wanted to keep producing and make records all the time, and I didn't want to have to wait till I had a production gig. You know what I mean? I wanted to. And the other thing was I started writing a lot of songs, and initially I was writing for other people to sing, and then even on my own album, Blood from a Stone, I initially wrote those songs with my good friend Dave Gutter with the intention of having other singers sing them. And then once we got into demoing them and I was singing them, we both were like, you know, this feels right. Let's just leave this, you know? And then that evolved into, okay, now I got to start singing this on the road. Now I got to have a band. But, which was nerve wracking as hell.
Yeah.
But, yeah, you know, the art of making records is something that I'm going to pursue forever. You know, it's like you never get to the end of it. You know what I mean? You're kind of always at the beginning, to be honest. You know, you learn more and more, but there's no end to it.
It's funny. This is my favorite Beatles song. And it's even more so my favorite because you guys played it in the way you did.
Nice.
Can you talk
Such a great song, man.
Oh my God. Yeah.
I haven't heard that in a really long time. Wow.
Really?
Yeah.
Can you talk about that experience as far as, you know, making a Beatles cover album in that, you know, in that way? I just thought it was a really cool and important album for just many different reasons.
Yeah, that I just talked about this the other day, so it's actually fresh in my memory. And I don't know if I have all the details correct, but I'm going to tell you what I got.
Okay.
This was a while ago. We were on tour, and we had like, it was one of those things where we had like Thursday, Friday, Saturday somewhere like in Maine and Vermont or something, and then we had like Boston and New York the following week, like starting on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. You know, we would do those types of runs. Neil and I were planning on going home to New York. Alan lived in Massachusetts, so I remember this much. We're driving from like Vermont down to Massachusetts, where then Neil and I were gonna like take, I think, a train back to New York, and it was snowing, and the weather was kind of crazy. And the whole ride down, I had just gotten, I can't remember, it must have been iTunes or maybe it was a CD of the remastered Beatles catalog that they'd put out around that time. So we were just listening to that in the background, and we were like, okay, well, Neil and I were like, well, we'll spend like half of one day getting to New York. We'll spend one day at home, and then we'll spend the whole half of that other day getting to the next gig. Why don't we just crash in Massachusetts with Alan and do some rehearsing or some recording, because he had a studio there. And I think like we were like, yeah, that's a good plan. Well, what should we record? And then like maybe an hour later we come to I'm like, man, let's just like cut some Beatles songs. We don't have to write anything, you know, we only have 2 days. So let's just figure out some songs to record. So we didn't plan it at all, really. And I remember like our management didn't even know we did it. Basically, so then we showed up, started recording. We recorded for like a day and a half, 2 days. And that's what it was. And the only way that we didn't rehearse really the songs, we would play one. We kind of made a playlist of what we wanted to do vaguely. We'd play one, we'd listen to it, we'd play on it a little bit, and then we'd record, and then we go to the next one. So it was a really fast thing. Wow. And I attribute it to two things. One thing was obviously the Beatles are the best songwriters of all time. So anything that you're going to do with the Beatles is going to be good, you know, but we were like a pretty fine, well-oiled machine at that point, where like we'd been doing residencies and we'd been playing together so much that we had a communication that was really special, you know. And I look back at that now because I've developed a lot of bands. I've been a part of so many things, and you know, sometimes, you know, I wouldn't say I would say that I've always been appreciative of how special that connection with the Alan and Neil is, but it's been magnified in recent years of like how important it was. And, you know, they'd been playing together their entire lives, you know, since they were children. And I'd been playing with them for a solid 10 years, maybe at that point. Wow. And we had a really interesting thing that you can't really pinpoint. And it was a lot of hours playing together, but it also was like we were the right match. You know what I mean? They were the right match. And I was fortunate is really part of, you know, because when I first started with that band, like I was not good. You know what I mean? I mean, if you listen to the very beginning of it, I mean, I don't think I was horrible, but it was like I didn't know, you know, I didn't know soul jazz like the way they did. You know, I kind of jumped into. I bought my first hollow body guitar on the way to our first rehearsal.
Oh wow!
At a pawn shop, it was $50. You mean I was like a rock and roll kid, you know, and I'd been into funk and stuff, but you know, I'd never. So at this point, and when we got to the Beatles stuff, I had done a bunch of years of playing, you know, soul jazz and learning kind of like doing the thing with heavier strings and doing more of like a jazz funk thing. Yeah. And then when we got to this era, I was really got to like flex my more rock and roll roots. Like if you listen to the track we were just playing, that I was just playing blues riffs, you know, and the Beatles songs were so ripe for that. You know what I mean? And the grooves that Alan and Neil laid down were just like perfect, you know? So, you know, it was one of those things where it was just so natural, you know? It was like, it wasn't pre-thought. It wasn't a business move. It was just like, hey, let's try this and see what happens. Why not? You know, we're all here. We have a day off. We have 2 days. We're sitting in Alan's studio. Just let's hit record and try playing these Beatles songs. And then it was my brother, who was the manager at the time, his idea to call Rubber Soul Live. He was like, Rubber Soul Live. And we were like, wait, we didn't do Rubber Soul. We did like all these different songs. And he was like, doesn't matter. So, and he was right. No one ever questioned that. They were like, oh yeah, it's just Beatles. It's just Beatles songs. And, you know, we had no idea that anyone would care that we did it. You know, it was like, and then like when it came out, people loved it, you know, and for years later, we've been asked to do that live, and we went to Japan and we've done it live a couple times there. We've done like nights in New York City of like doing the Beatles stuff, and it was such a fun process because it was so, I don't want to say it was easy. I mean, but it was. There's like the songs were already there. To me, making records is so much a part of having it's all about having great material. You know what I mean? Absolutely. Performing it well is important, but the material is the most important. So to have material that good to play was a blessing. You know?
That's awesome. You know, it's funny. There's this notion that I stand by, and I say that, you know, when you're a good songwriter, when someone else covers your music and it sounds better. Yeah. You know, and I feel like the Beatles is such a huge testament to that. But yeah, man, just the pockets that you guys get in on all those songs, I was like, wow, like I have a whole new, just like it's a whole heap better like impression, and just more like, even it's funny, like I've always had a huge respect for the Beatles, but even more so when other people cover, it's like, oh wow, they covered it in that way and it sounds amazing. So that's awesome. That's awesome. Wow. So obviously, you know, a part of, one of the things that you also do is you're a podcaster. You have this amazing podcast Plus One, which is great. I remember when you first started to roll it out, you know, during the pandemic, and you've spoken to just some really, you know, amazing artists. Obviously, some of those folks have probably just been your friends as well that you've, you know, worked with over the past. Tell me a little bit about that experience as far as just starting it, and then just if you've gotten any like personal takeaways just from that experience.
You know, I wanted to do it for a really long time. I had a show on Sirius XM that was through the Jam On station where I would come on and mainly play music, but I started doing interviews on that. This is years ago,
Hmm.
and but because of the way they operate, the interviews had to be short. They had to be only like 90 seconds because they had to play music on those stations.
Hmm.
So I always had this idea of like having my own like kind of talk show. And then I started listening to podcasts, you know, and I got really into like the Mark Maron podcast and a few others that were kind of just people talking, you know,
Yeah.
but interesting people. So I initially was going to do it when I moved to California. I had a studio this is before I moved in here, but I had a studio in the back of my house, and I wanted it to initially be like someone comes to my studio, we rap, we talk, and then we perform a song together. We record that video, boom. It was originally going to be a video thing, you know?
Oh, okay.
And then the pandemic hit, and I'd already recorded like two or three, but I didn't know how I was going to release it yet. And then my manager mentioned this company called Osiris. He said they're putting together podcasts. They're interested in your podcast. So basically, we put together a thing, and I was like, okay, well, let's do this. And then I can't remember if the timeline, if that was before the pandemic. I think it was that we kind of said, okay, we're going to do this. And then the
Nice.
pandemic hit, and initially, I was like, oh man, it's going to be so hard to get people to my studio.
Mm.
And then I was like, well, shit, there's this thing called Zoom. You know what I mean? And Zoom, at that point, people didn't even know what the hell Zoom was.
Yeah.
This is a year and a half ago. No one knew Zoom. So I started, I think the first few I did were like FaceTime, you know, and then we started using Zoom. And I realized that my timing was actually perfect because all of a sudden it was like, oh, Dave Matthews is texting me right back. Like people were bored, you know?
Yeah.
Chris Robinson's like, let's do it. John Mayer, whoever, they're all around. They're all sitting at home, and I know they're at home. You know what I mean? They can't bullshit me.
Exactly.
So it really, I know within those first couple weeks that I started doing it, I think I recorded like 20 or something. You know, I was doing it every day, and then so I compiled them and I started releasing them, and yeah, man, it just became something really fun to do. All of a sudden, I was sitting at home. You know, my wife was pregnant. I was like, you know, I need to be doing shit every day. And I was obviously making a record too. I was recording, but my off time from that, I just started interviewing my friends. It was also like, to be honest, like a good way to connect with my friends. It was like, because like the first 20 episodes were all like my good friends, you know. Now I'm expanding into in reaching out to people that I don't know as well. But the first 6 months was all like good friends, and you know, so a lot of it was just kind of shooting the shit, but then some of it were like questions that I'd never asked them that I always wanted to, you know, like Jeff Basker, you know, he and I like grew up together, but I never really knew the whole story of how like Kanye West put him in the producer seat and how he evolved into what he became. And you know, with Derek, there was like a lot of questions about the early years and his dad and those things that I wanted to ask that I never did, you know, because it's different when you're in a podcast. You kind of get licensed to like ask all these questions that you wouldn't ask when you're just sitting in the backstage or sitting in the van.
Very
you
true.
know, and then there's also a lot of just like the conversations that we normally have that come out. So I think it's been great on a lot of levels. I think also I've learned a lot from it. You know, I've had people like Bela Fleck on there who I was friends with, but we weren't, you know, I've never asked him really any of this stuff. So like I got to like really dive deep, and also in doing some of the research that I've done with some artists, I've learned so much in that process. You know, had Randy Jackson on and like learned all about like his label experience and A&R and his whole evolution into becoming what he became.
Yeah.
So it's inspiring as well, you know.
Wow.
For me,
I think it's that's pretty amazing. Yeah, because I always think about, you know, when you have a platform such as a podcast where people can really open up, you know, to talk about, you know, their lives or just whatever they want to talk about. And when you have that, when you're able to witness someone that is able to share, you know, just a wealth of knowledge and things like that. There's such an importance, and such a uniqueness to that. So I just find that really passionate.
Absolutely.
So awesome. Very cool. Man, very, very cool. Well, before we get out of here, anything else to bring up? I know technically the episode's going to come out on your birthday, so happy future today birthday.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate it, man. Yeah, I'm excited for this year. This is a big year for me. I'm releasing a new album September 17th. It's called Always. I made it during the pandemic. And then I also have another project that's primarily instrumental that'll be coming out behind that. I'm not sure on the date, but a lot of new music to release to the world. Awesome. That has been created in this downtime. So I'm excited to get that out there. Yeah, man, it's an exciting time. I think we're all excited to get out and play again. It's been a crazy year and a half, and yeah, man, I think everyone's excited. So I am feeling very positive about this year.
Awesome. Well, Eric Krasno, it's been a great pleasure having you here on the show, man. Thank you so much. Thanks so much.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. Well, folks, this is Jerrell Powell from the 440 Guitar Podcast. We'll jam again soon, and have a good day.